A Pair of Schoolgirls by Angela Brazil. Chapter 12. The Subterranean Cavern. The Ringbora Hydropathik was not only celebrated for fishing and golf, the neighborhood itself held many attractions. The mountain's round, grim stony ridges contained curiosities of nature such as are only found in a limestone district. There were wonderful subterranean caverns, full of stalactites and stalagmites, underground lakes and rivers, and mysterious potholes leading no one knew whither. "We ought to make an excursion to Lingham Cave," said Percy Helm one day. "It's one of the local sights, and it seems a pity to miss it. Couldn't we arrange to go all together in a big party? Tomorrow could be a good opportunity." When tomorrow came, none of the elders seemed disposed to fall in with Percy's plans. Dr. Longton and Mr. Clark were bent on fishing, Mrs. Longton was tired and preferred to stay in the garden, and Mr. and Mrs. Helm wished to play golf. Mrs. Clark would not hear of Allison's going on such an expedition. "I've been before to Lingham," she said, "and I know from experience how damp and cold it is inside the cave. You were coughing last night, Bertie, and I don't want to risk your catching a bad cold. You must be content to do something quiet today." Dorothy easily obtained Mrs. Longton's consent, so she and the three young Helms took packets of lunch and started to walk over the fells to Lingham, a distance of about 4 miles. The weather was still cold, and the crests of some of the highest hills were tipped with snow. The keen, bracing air felt like a tonic. The four strode along briskly over the short moorland grass, admiring the rugged gorge whence the river flowed first between two sheer walls of limestone, and then through a chasm that seemed to have been made by the rending asunder of a mountain of rock. "It's a primeval kind of place," said Gabrielle. "One can understand what a terrible upheaval there must have been to split the cliffs and twist all the strata out of shape. What enormous force it must have needed. One wonders if any human beings were there when it happened." "If there were, they wouldn't be there long," said Percy. "The smallest of those rocks would be enough to crush an army." "It's a pity Allison isn't here," remarked Dorothy. "She's rather keen on geology, and one gets a much better general view of the gorge from here than from Hydro." "Yes, I'm sorry she wasn't allowed to come," replied Gabrielle. "I think Mrs. Clark is fearfully nervous. I'm glad Mother doesn't fuss over me to such an extent. Still, it has another side to it. It must be rather nice to be a treasured only child." "Then you should have been born in a different family. You made a bad choice in ours," said Eric. "How any of you are there all together?" asked Dorothy. "7, we've left the little ones behind. Only Norma goes to the Cole." "Yes, the other 3 are nursery children. You don't know what it is to be eldest daughter. Be thankful you haven't 3 small nuisances at home." "I wish I had," said Dorothy. "All right, you may change places with me. I'll hand over the whole set of brothers and sisters, Percy and Eric included. "A happy exchange for us," murmured Percy, with a look at Dorothy. "You horrid boy," said Gabrielle. "I want to know why Percy has brought that coil of rope with him," inquired Dorothy. "I've been wondering ever since we started." "Well, I'm quite prepared to satisfy your curiosity. Let us sit down and eat our lunch while I expound. There are some jolly stones here for seats." All four were very ready for lunch, though it was only 12 o'clock. The keen air had given them fine appetites, and the ham sandwiches and chicken drumsticks disappeared quickly, not to speak of the bread and cheese and cakes. "They don't put up bad lunches at the Hydro," said Percy, aiming his last chicken bone at a bird that flew overhead. "What about the rope?" asked Dorothy again. "I'm still inquisitive. It's an idea of mine. You know, everybody goes to Lingham Cave, it's a regular show place. You pay your shilling, and you're taken round by a guide who tells you where to step, and not to knock your head, and all that kind of stuff, and prates away about geology and natural curiosities and the rest of it, as if he'd learnt it off like a lesson. Well, instead of going where everybody else goes, I think it would be much better fun to explore a place of our own. There's another cave at the other side of Lingham, on the spur of Wear and Scar. I saw the entrance to it last Friday, when I walked over with Dr. Shaw. He pointed it out to me, and said very few people had been down it, but it was quite as fine as the other, and had splendid, what do you call those thingamjigs? Oh yes, stalactites, and an underground waterfall. A lesson in golf. "Is there a guide there?" asked Eric. "No, that's the best of it, no shillings to pay, and no bothering lecture. People fight shy of it because it's so out of the way and rather difficult to go down. The passage is narrow, and there's one bad place. I thought if we had a rope, though, we could manage it easily, and look. I've brought all these candles and 3 boxes of matches." "It would be ripping to see an underground waterfall," said Eric. "There isn't one in Lingham Avenue." "Yes, we might never get such an opportunity again." "Who votes for Wear and Scar?" "I do," said Dorothy promptly. The idea of an adventure tempted her. She was always attracted by the unknown. "I suppose we should be all right?" "It will be quite safe, I mean?" queried Gabrielle, a little doubtfully. "Right as a trivet, with a rope and candles," replied Percy. "I expect if this cave were near a Lingham village it would be more popular than the other. It's fearfully far from his station, though, which doesn't suit trippers." "We're trippers ourselves if we make a trial trip," laughed Eric. All the 4 young people were excited at the prospect of exploring a little-known cavern without the assistance of a guide. They felt like a band of pioneers in a fresh country, or the discoverers of a new continent. None of them in the least realized the risk of the proceeding, and no older person was there to preach wisdom. Percy, who had been over the fells before, knew the way, and therefore assumed the direction of the party. Instead of going down to Lingham, they turned up the hill instead, and struck across the spur of Wear and Scar. It was a grim, desolate part of the country. The bare rocks, upheaved in strange shapes and unclothed by any greenery, seemed like the skeleton of the earth exposed to view. Stone walls took the place of hedges, and there was scarcely a human habitation within sight. Scattered here and there over the moorland were curious natural pits called potholes, deep and dark as wells, and with a sound of rushing water at the bottom. Into one of these a small stream emptied itself, and was swallowed up bodily. "They are fearful places," said Dorothy, holding Gabrielle's hand, and gazing half fascinated over the edge of the pit into the bubbling depths below. "It's like a witch's cauldron. You feel there's double toil and trouble going on down there." "People must have been fearfully superstitious about these holes in olden times," remarked Gabrielle. "Rather. They attributed them to His Satanic Majesty, thought they were the blowholes of the netherworld. In fact, I don't suppose any of the natives here would care to go near them tonight," said Percy. "Come along. It makes me dizzy to stare down," said Gabrielle. "I feel as if something were drawing me in." "The wizard who lives at the bottom," laughed Dorothy. "We're certainly in a very peculiar part of the country. Is it far to the cave now?" "No, we're quite close. I have my bearings, and I'm pretty sure that it's just round the other side of that crag." "How exciting! Do let us be quick." The mouth of the cave proved to be a small, narrow opening in the side of the hill, no taller or wider than the little postern gate of an old castle. For a few yards inside there was a brown glimmer, but beyond lay inky darkness. The girls, after a first peep, drew back with a shudder, half of real fear, and half of delighted anticipation of a new experience. Percy had taken out the candles and was busy lighting them. "There's one for each of us," he said. "And we must each have some matches in our pockets, in case of emergencies." "What emergencies?" asked Gabrielle. "Well, suppose we got separated." "Separated? Don't talk of it. You're not going to lose me, I can tell you. I shall hold on to your coat the whole way. I shan't go in at all if you mean to play hide and seek. Promise you won't lose me." "Don't be silly. Nobody wants to lose you," said Percy. "I'm only taking proper precautions. There. Are you ready? Eric and I will go first, and you and Dorothy can follow." "Shades of Pluto, it's spooky," exclaimed Eric, leading the way. The passage ran level for about 15 yards, then began abruptly to descend into the hollow of the mountain. The walls were jagged and uneven, there were frequent turnings and windings, and the floor was rough with small stones or lumps of rock. In 2 or 3 places it was very damp. Moisture dripped from the roof and oozed in limestone tears down the walls, forming slimy, milky pools underfoot. In the distance they could hear the gurgling of water. The two boys, as pioneers, walked slowly, holding their lights so as to examine well the ground in front. The girls followed them loosely. "I should think it's like this in the catacombs," said Gabrielle. "It reminds me of the story of the princess and the goblin," said Dorothy. "Haven't read it." "You benighted girl. What you've missed. It's the most gorgeous tale that was ever written. The goblins lived in a mountain just like this. They had a great underground hall, and dwellings in mysterious corners and caves. They wanted to steal the little Princess Irene, to marry her to their prince, only Curdie outwitted them. I feel as if we're following Irene's thread at present." "I hope you're following me," said Eric. "We're coming to a bad place, so you'd better go carefully." The floor of the passage, which had been growing more and more uneven and rugged, suddenly shelved down like a ladder. "Yes, this is a bad bit," muttered Percy. "It will certainly need care. What a good thing I brought the rope." "Are you sure it's safe to venture?" asked Gabrielle. "Yes, it's difficult, but it's safe enough. Dr. Shaw told me about this place. It's called the Chute. It's something like a long smooth slide. We must lower one another with the rope." "Who is to lower the last?" said Dorothy. "Oh, I'll manage to climb down all right without. Eric can go first, then he can help you two girls at the bottom." Eric, with the rope tied round his waist, and his candle held well overhead, started cautiously down the incline in a sitting posture. "It's as smooth as a slide," he called. "Don't pay out the rope too fast, old chap. Let me down gently. That's better. I'm getting along famously now. I can steady myself with one hand on the wall. Phew. That was a scorcher. There's a nasty twist here. Steady. Let go a bit. Right-o. Here I am." The tension on the rope stopped, so he had evidently reached his goal. The others, peering into the darkness, could just see the glimmer of his candle round a piece of projecting rock. "Where are you?" they shouted. "In a much wider passage. Come on. I've untied the rope, so you can wind it up. It isn't really difficult at all going down, if you're careful of this corner at the end. I'll climb up and give you each a hand as you come round." "You go next," Dorothy said Gabrielle. It was rather a horrible experience, Dorothy thought, after the rope was tied round her waist, to start on that steep, dark descent, even though Eric was waiting to help her at the bottom. The chute was moist, and as slippery as ice. She felt dreadfully helpless, and if it had not been for the staying power of the rope, she would have shot down as if she had been tobogganing. She managed to aid herself a little by grasping angles of the wall, though one hand was incommoded by holding the candle. "It's all right. Don't squeak, you've got over the worst now," said Eric, extending a welcome grip at the awkward corner. "Put your foot against that ledge, now hen, swing yourself round. High. More rope, up there, let yourself slide now, it's only a few feet. You've done it. Hooray!" Dorothy felt like a heroine as she scrambled to her feet and untied the rope. She peeped anxiously up the chute to see how Gabrielle would fare. The latter, after protesting vigorously that she daren't and couldn't and wouldn't, was at length persuaded to try, and accomplished the descent with many squeals of terror. "Pooh! What a fuss you girls make," said Eric. "There's nothing to be frightened about." When his sister was safely landed at the bottom, Percy managed to descend unaided, and the four started once more on their march of exploration. They were now in a long gallery, much loftier and wider than the passage above. It extended for about 100 feet, then narrowed and lowered abruptly, so that for a few yards they were obliged to stoop to get along. Suddenly they all stopped with a cry of amazement. The passage ended with a natural arch, and they found themselves staring into a vast subterranean chamber. The cavern was oval in shape, and had probably once been an underground reservoir for water. From the roof, like huge icicles, hung innumerable stalactites, many of which, meeting with stalagmites that rose from the floor, formed pillars as beautiful as the marble columns in a Greek temple. In the faint light of the 4 candles the scene was immensely impressive. The cave seemed to stretch before the spectators like the dim aisles of some great cathedral. They could not see to its farthest extent, but from somewhere in the distance came the noise of rushing water. Walking carefully between the stalagmites, they commenced a tour of investigation, holding the lights high above their heads, so as to gain as good a view as possible. "If we only had a piece of magnesium ribbon to burn, wouldn't it be magnificent?" sighed Percy. "Or even a motor lamp," added Eric. Guided by the sound of the water, they reached the corner of the chamber, where a natural wonder presented itself. From a hole about 15 feet above them issued a cascade, which poured in a foaming fall over a ledge of rock, ran for a distance of about 8 yards over the floor of the cavern, then plunged into a deep hole and disappeared. "I wonder where it comes out, if it ever comes out at all," said Dorothy, shuddering as she watched the black water whirl into the dark abyss. "Lower down the mountain, probably, but I shouldn't care to try the experiment of jumping in to find out," said Eric. "It's a weird place, but it's worth seeing. I'm glad we came. I believe it's finer than Lingham. And we've done it on our own, too, without any bothersome guide." "We've got to go back yet," said Gabrielle. "Hadn't we better make a start? It must be getting late." "Exactly 20 minutes to 4," said Percy, consulting his watch. "Then we must go at once. Remember, we have a long walk before us." Quite loath to leave the marvels of the subterranean chamber, they tore themselves away, each first breaking off a small stalactite as a souvenir. "I shall treasure my limestone icicle," said Dorothy. "I shall score if I take it to the geology class at school." "I've got an extra one to give to the college museum," said Gabrielle. "I hope they won't break in my pocket. I've wrapped them artfully in my handkerchief." Arrived at the chute, Percy climbed up first, with one end of the rope in his hand, then, stationing himself firmly at the top, announced his readiness to haul up the others. Gabrielle started next, crawling on hands and knees, and helping herself as best she could by the projections of rock at the side. It was much more difficult to ascend than to descend, for the surface was so smooth and slippery, it was impossible to get any grip. Almost her whole weight depended upon the rope. She was a heavy girl, and the strain was great. Percy at the top heaved with all his strength. "Oh dear, it's dreadful," cried Gabrielle. "It's cutting my waist in two." "Wait a moment, Percy, don't tug so hard. I want to catch this ledge. Let go of the rock, and I'll give one good pull," commanded Percy. "If you'll trust yourself absolutely to me, I'll have you up in a jiffy." Gabrielle loosened her hold, and for one moment threw herself entirely upon the rope. Perhaps it was not strong enough for the purpose, or possibly it had been frayed in the descent by contact with a sharp rock. There was a snap, a sudden, agonized cry, and Gabrielle was precipitated to the bottom of the chasm. She fell heavily, extinguishing her candle as she went, and rolling almost to the feet of Eric and Dorothy, who were standing at the bottom of the chute looking upwards. "Good gracious! What's happened?" "Gabrielle, are you hurt?" ejaculated Percy, descending to the rescue with more haste than discretion, and bending over the prostrate form of his sister. "Hold a light, Eric, I can't see her face." "Oh! Oh! I thought I was being killed," gasped Gabrielle, raising herself to a sitting position. "Give me your hand, Percy." "Oh! Stop, stop! My foot! I believe I've broken my ankle." The explorers stared at one another in blankest dismay. This was indeed a predicament. What were they to do, buried in the depths of the earth, and miles away from help of any kind? "Are you sure it's broken, or could you manage to get up if we each took your arm?" suggested Eric. "No. No. Don't touch me. It's agony if I move." "Better let me pull your boot off, quick," said Dorothy, dropping on her knees by the side of her friend. It was a very different matter applying first aid here from how it had been at the ambulance class in the gymnasium at the college. Except pocket handkerchiefs, there were no materials of any kind to be had. Splints were an impossibility. Dorothy bound up the foot as well as she could, but her every touch was painful to her poor patient. "You're sitting in such a wet place. Couldn't we lift you just a little?" she suggested. "No, please leave me alone." "Never mind the wet." Gabrielle's rosy cheeks had grown very white. She looked almost ready to faint. The two boys turned to each other in desperation. "We can't haul her up that chute with a broken ankle," said Percy. "I must go back to the hydro for help, and you must stay with her." "I'll be as quick as I possibly can, I'll run all the way." "Mind you don't tumble into any potholes," then called Gabrielle anxiously, as he scrambled up the chasm and departed. Then began a long, weary vigil of many interminable hours. The candles had burnt so low that the trio did not dare to have them all lighted together, in case they should be left in the dark before assistance came. They therefore used one at a time, and by its faint gleam the deep shadows of the rocks appeared more dim and gloomy than ever. "It's almost like being buried alive," shivered Gabrielle. "I'm glad Allison didn't come with us," said Dorothy. "We've landed ourselves in an uncommonly tight fix," remarked Eric. Would the time never pass? Hour after hour went by. Wet, cold, and hungry, and chilled to the bone, the unfortunate trio sat and waited. They were almost in despair when at last they heard a distant shout, and a few moments afterwards a strong light flashed down the chasm. The band of rescuers proved to consist of Mr. Helm, Dr. Shaw, the medical attendant of the hydropathic, Dr. Longton, Mr. Clark, and two gardeners who were well acquainted with the neighborhood, Percy, of course, leading the way. They had brought motor lanterns, ropes, and a number of other appliances, the most important of all in the eyes of the three shivering young people being a thermos flask full of hot soup. The first duty for the doctors was to set the broken ankle, then came the more critical task of removing the injured girl from the cave. Her father, who was fortunately the tallest and strongest member of the party, took her in his arms, and, aided partly by ropes and partly by the help of Dr. Longton and Mr. Clark, he succeeded in carrying her up the slippery chute onto the level above. Even there their troubles were not over. The many twistings and windings and angles of the tortuous passage were difficult to negotiate without giving undue pain to poor Gabrielle, who was already suffering enough. Her rescuers were only able to proceed very slowly, and with frequent intervals of rest, and by the time the party reached the surface of the fell it was past 11 o'clock. None of them ever forgot that weird midnight walk back to Ringbora. It was a wild, windy night, with heavy clouds chasing one another across the sky and obscuring the light of the waning moon. Hurst and Chorley, the two gardeners, led the way with the lanterns, then came Mr. Helm and Dr. Shaw, carrying Gabrielle on an improvised stretcher, and the others followed closely behind, Dr. Longton helping Dorothy. The ground was rough and stony, and every now and then their guides had to stop to take their bearings, for there were several potholes and other danger spots to be avoided. The first grey streak of dawn was showing in the sky when the party, thoroughly exhausted, at last arrived at the hydropathic. Gabrielle won't be at the call again for ever so long, said Allison to Dorothy next day. Dr. Shaw thinks it may be 6 weeks before she's able to walk. Uncle David says it's a miracle she wasn't killed. I'm glad I didn't go, and yet, rather wistfully, I don't suppose I shall ever have the opportunity of a real adventure again. It must have been so exciting. It's nicer to read about adventures than to have them, said Dorothy. It wasn't thrilling at all at the time, it was cold and wet and horrid. I'm delighted to have seen the cave, but I wouldn't go through last night again, not if anyone offered me £100.